Hello. Welcome to another episode of Ancient Office Hours by the Ozymandias Project. Trireme Transit is now boarding for all new and returning passengers. Now departing, present ponderings. Next stop is Ancient Office Hours at a library lost in the sands of time.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 94 of Ancient Office Hours. This week, my guest is Dr. Astrid van Oyen, a Roman archaeologist and professor at Radboud University. Her research explores the social, cultural, and economic dimensions of empire, craft production, storage, and rural economies. She is particularly interested in the socioeconomic history of non-elites. Her most recent book, The Socioeconomics of Roman Storage, Agriculture, Trade, and Family, cuts across the scales of farmer and state to trace the practical and moral reverberations of storage from villas in Italy to silos in Gaul, and from houses in Pompeii to warehouses in Ostia. In this episode, we discussed her focus on the agrarian experience in the ancient world, the development of rural economies, examining practices of gift exchange, pottery and storage, and media adaptations of rural Roman daily life. I hope you enjoy this episode, and if you like what you hear, please give us a 5-star rating and review us on Apple or Spotify. Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to be able to speak to you, and I hope to start you off with what I believe should be a pretty fun and easy question. And that is, how did you get into ancient history, classics, archaeology?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, let me say, Lexi, it's such a pleasure to be here, albeit virtually. And I should probably tell the audience how accommodating you've been in staying up until midnight to facilitate me being here virtually with you. So thanks for that. How did I end up being a Roman archaeologist? Well, so I studied in Belgium. I'm Belgian originally, and it's still not terribly expensive to go to university there, at least compared to the United States. And that means that not all students make such conscious choices about what to do after high school. I liked most of my subjects in high school. Oh, the other difference with uni or university or college in the United States is that you choose a specific subject right away. So it's not a liberal arts education. You choose archaeology from day one. Or I chose mathematics because I really loved it in high school, and I actually wanted to be an astronomer. And so that was the route into becoming that, but it wasn't a terribly thought through choice. And I soon realized that I liked mathematics, but only in combination with lots of other subjects and not only maths. And so after a couple of months, I decided I wanted to quit and do something else. And it's sort of the urban legend that I've since told is that because I had to go speak to this counseling service or something about, okay, so you want to drop out, what to do now? And they offered me this subject book with other subjects, and archaeology, starting with an A, was one of the first ones. And so that stuck with me, and I thought, that seems like fun. So whether or not that's entirely accurate, I did end up choosing archaeology then, and quickly realized that it was a really fantastic choice for someone who's terribly bad at making choices and who likes a bit of everything, because it's really the subject where you get to do a bit of everything. We had some languages, some ancient languages, some philosophy, some anthropology, some physical geography, some geology, and then of course history and the classic archaeology courses. So I really enjoyed it, and I still do, and I think that's still the reason why I love it, is because I get to do lots of different kinds of things and think about lots of different kinds of subjects and themes and questions. And that's perfect for me. Yeah, that's my backstory. I still have some regrets about not becoming an astronomer, but
It's okay. The wonderful thing about classics, right, is that it's so interdisciplinary. So I'm sure if you wanted to branch into some kind of astronomy thing, you totally could find a way to do it.
archaeoastronomy, yeah, that's actually a thing, I think, but I've never, I've never ventured in. I've sort of shut that door. But what's interesting is that I've never been the person who visited museums as a kid or who was really enamored with the ancient Egyptians or whatever as a kid. So that's given me a bit of a different profile than some some of my colleagues.
Yeah, I mean, I love hearing how different people come to the field, because I was definitely one of those kids in sixth grade enamored by the pyramids of Egypt, and then of course the ancient Greeks. And I said, well, I have to study that now. So yeah, as someone who wasn't that person then, how did you get into the Romans specifically? And I always want to ask my Latinist colleagues, because most of the people I came up with through the system, right? We all became Hellenists and we deeply love Greece and probably unfairly are a bit prejudiced against Rome. So, how did you come to love and want to study Rome?
I mean, I'm not one to defend Rome against other possible subjects, but also sort of by accident, because I studied in Leuven in Belgium, and it's not, I mean, it was a great department, but it's not terribly big. And so what was on offer was Rome in basically Asia Minor. There was a lot of expertise there. And the Minoans. So I strangely also have quite a lot of background knowledge about the Minoans, a Minoan civilization, and then a bit of prehistory, but I was always sort of very processualist, so very theoretically it didn't click with me very much. So yeah, I sort of by accident, based on what was on offer. And then also I had my first field work. Well, actually my first field work was in Belgium. It was quite sobering. It's a lot of sort of digging in the rain, finding nothing, which, is a good experience in and of itself. But then I had the opportunity to take part in the Sagalassos excavations, which is a big excavation project that my university ran and still runs in modern day Turkey. I spent 2 months there in summer as a second year undergrad. And so then I was hooked. I just had so much more, by then I had so much more background knowledge about Roman material culture. So it was sort of path dependency, although not unlike my choice to stick with archaeology. I think my choice to stick with the Romans for now is that there's a lot of data, and it was a world empire. So there are a lot of questions about economy, power, social inequality that you can explore, that are very fruitfully explored in this particular context. And so, yeah, I think that's why I stuck with it. Although I still like to think that maybe I can work on something, another period or time, or region at some point.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. And I mean, who doesn't love the idea, right, of being able to study an ancient empire and all of its cool socio-political, cultural dimensions and all that. And it's interesting, this trend I've only started to notice because I look at a lot at reception. And so in looking sort of at like the media aspect, I was sitting here with a friend the other day having a conversation, and I remember saying something like, oh, isn't it weird that when we have media adaptations of things, we have things like the HBO Rome or whatever that show a lot of sort of the non-elite lifestyles and what goes on in sort of the everyday quote unquote Roman lives. But we don't really have that for a lot of Greek stuff. It's mostly like the mythology. It's all about gods and heroes and monsters and stuff when it comes to the Greek stuff. And so that kind of makes its way in, I've noticed, to formal study, where I feel like I hear more people who do the Romans say they do like non-elite something or other, just because that seems to be more available. Is that your impression, from someone who does get to study the non-elite people?
Well, there's definitely a trend, and rightly so, in Roman studies. I wouldn't say there's loads of data available yet, but there have been some really important projects, especially in the rural part of the Roman world, which was anything from 85 to 99% of people, depending on the region, would have lived in outside of cities. So, and that until quite recently was something of a black hole in our knowledge, and actually still is. The data we have tends to still be of a coarser resolution. So it's very tricky not to impose frameworks based on, say, literary sources or extrapolated from what we know from urban life and things like that. So I, as an insider, I'm somewhat maybe optimistic, but somewhat more sober about where we're at right now and how much work there's still to be done. But it's an interesting trend, regarding the difference in the sort of popular image. And I think, there's been really important work in, Lynn Foxhall, for instance, and her work on the Greek countryside. there's been important work too on Greek peasants, Greek small farmers. So yeah, I wonder, I'm not sure why that hasn't, I wonder if it's to do indeed with the sort of mythologizing and or with this idea of the Greek world as somewhat more romantic. And, you have those notions of democracy, of course, in the popular perception of ancient Greece and Athens, although it sort of blurs into one another in the reception. But you're the Hellenist, so I should ask you maybe somewhat more romantic notion of ancient Greek everyday life as people just sitting in the ecclesia and doing important work rather than farmers toiling. Or I've done some work on storage, some of the pioneering work on things like food shortages and food crisis has really been on ancient Greece. So, it's not that those subjects haven't been broached on a sort of macro scale level, but it's interesting to know that maybe they haven't made it into the kind of qualitative narratives that would inspire reception by a more popular audience.
It's an interesting phenomenon, and I definitely would like to know more about why that is. But, I don't think anyone can say for sure either way. But I think you're onto something with, we tend to have this very specific idea of ancient Greece, just the type of things we hear. It's a bit strange because a lot of the records, if we have any left over, they really weren't, written by or left by the sort of lower classes, the normal people. It usually is the upper class. And so I'm tempted to just be like, because it's Greece. And I don't know why we get more portrayals of just sort of domestic Roman life. I kind of think sometimes, is it because of is it maybe because at least here in the US, the founders prided themselves on like modeling our society after ancient Rome? Like, I have no idea. I'm speculating here, but it's interesting to think about. But like, I want to circle back to sort of the more rural parts of what you study, because one, that is an area that I didn't get to really go that deep in undergrad. They kind of take you to the big places and say, okay, we're going to look at this. And I always find the rural economies and the rural like happenings so interesting, because I took a great class on numismatics, on the study of coins in college. And it wasn't enough. It was just one introductory class. But I remember being shocked when I asked like basic questions like, oh, yes, we had coins and we had mints in the big cities and they made the thing. So like, did the coins easily make it out? And I think I remember asking my professor, did they trade goods in rural areas and money in the cities? I've come to learn more since those days. But for folks who may be listening to this, who didn't get to go to the classes I did, who may perhaps have the same notions, can you tell us, like, was money always a popular thing? Did it really have to start in the cities and slowly filter its way out? Like, was there a lot more trading of goods going on? So when these rural economies were starting up and going and growing, how did that work?
Your question is not that any question is ever stupid, but yours definitely was not, because actually it sort of sums up much of the debate of the last half century about monetization in, for instance, in my area, rural Roman Italy. There's been a big debate about to what extent exchange driven by coins, so monetized, was happening in the countryside. And I think much of that debate has moved on, in the sense that the idea that people in the countryside did not have coins or did not have an economic use for coins definitely no longer holds. But there still was probably a variety of mechanisms of exchange, just as there was a variety of social relations and social dependencies. There were probably people who were forced to work for others, whether slave or free. There were probably people who lent each other equipment or cooperation. There were probably various ways of indeed cooperating. There were probably various family structures with sort of people working for the family unit, so also non-monetized. But regardless of all those other variations, there was also an important part of exchanges that was monetized. So that was not barter, as you sketched it, goods exchanged for goods. Not that that didn't happen, but it's very difficult to attest. But so we the site where I excavate along with my colleagues Dora Venarucci from Arkansas and Gijs Stol from Melbourne. Matsuo, we call it a minor center, which is sort of those gray labels, right? One of those non-committal archaeological labels for saying this is something. It's about 2 hectares, our site. It's a site where various people probably lived, although it's very difficult to put an estimate to how many. Probably there were seasonal fluctuations in how many people there lived, but it's also a site where craft production happened. There's pottery being made, there's a blacksmith, and it's featured as a distribution hub for other things. So, for instance, ceramics that were produced inland, a consignment would be dropped off at Matsuo, maybe for further trade or for capillary distribution to the farmers in the area. So it's a site that catered for the needs of small farmers in the area around it. Of course, there are coin finds on this site, not quantities as you would find them on, say Cosa or in urban sites in Tuscany, but still significant quantities, showing that those coins did end up there, and they were used in exchange. Yeah, so that's my roundabout answer for saying your question is not stupid at all. It's actually the core of what has been debated for very long. And I think now that we have more and more excavations of the countryside outside of the villas, which is sort of where the elite rural dwellers lived, or at least farmed, that it's becoming clear that for Roman Italy, at least, this monetization happened there too. And of course, this is talking about roughly 1st century BC, 1st century AD. So we really peak late Republic, early Empire, peak period of development in Roman Italy, in the heartland. It's not sort of a finding that can easily be extrapolated to other areas. And I know for Roman Britain, there's still debate about, say, the degree of monetization of the countryside. But I think it's clear that in all areas that coinage was not, and trickled down to lots of areas, and that actually most of these areas were integrated one way or another into the bigger circulation patterns of the empire.
I mean, I think it's fascinating just because, as you were talking, one of the things I was thinking about then, if that is kind of a debate that's been happening and people are wondering, thinking a little bit about distance, right? If it's rural, it's implied that it's kind of outside of the big cities. And so obviously, if you're not one of the little rural places like right next to or right outside of like Rome or another city, there's probably a measure of distance. And then obviously, there weren't cars, you had horses and donkeys and other things. So in terms of like immediacy of payment, whether that be actual money or exchange of goods, that kind of sparked this idea of, so say someone comes from the city with their coins or, with their money, and they go out to somewhere rural, I don't know, to visit a family member or something. And they say, oh, well, I would like to have this item. But, if you're out kind of in a rural area, I don't know, like, is money actually useful? Because if a lot of people don't have it, is it seen as like something that will get you something as immediate as like, here, take my chicken for my whatever? So how did that work if someone wanted to have money and someone was like, but I want like your chicken because I'm not going into the city, and so what will I do with the coin where no one else here will want it?
I'm not sure, first of all, that someone would come down from Rome and want to buy a chicken at Matsuo, which is where we work. But also, so I think that the mechanisms of trade that we need to imagine are probably much more segmented, in the sense that they're more globally integrated than we previously imagined, but each segment is probably much shorter than we previously imagined, or at least many of them. I mean, we're not talking here about, grain import from Egypt to Rome, those kinds of very long segments. But for much of the Roman world, I think the segments were much shorter. And so the trade chains were much more fragmented, probably. To get to your question of, what could you do with coinage in the countryside, it's not that people didn't have coins. So I think this part of the debate is sort of settled. People did have coins. Coins were used quite regularly. They might not have been all-encompassing, but we know that too. I mean, we still don't use coins for everything today, not only because we have credit mechanisms, but also because we have informal ties. There's an informal economy. There are you're baking cookies, you need sugar, you run to your neighbor, you don't pay for that because you'll reciprocate at some other time. We have gifts, we have coins, and everyone had coins, I think, or everyone had a use for coins. Would be my sense. And I'm very much not a numismatist, but coins, and again, I don't go back, my research doesn't go back to what, for instance, Seth Bernard looks at earlier Republican periods when maybe coins weren't as integrated. But by the time that the sites I study start, coins are there. There's no imagining that world without coinage. One important injector of coinage or coin use is probably the military and military payments and veterans who former soldiers who arrive in that rural world, but also, for instance, the blacksmith. Probably I mentioned this blacksmith's workshop that we found at Merteuol, which was super interesting, not only because a blacksmith workshop is pretty cool, but also because it was abandoned after a disastrous fire. So we found all of the tools in place, and sure enough, there were a couple of coins left on the workshop floor. This blacksmith was receiving coins in exchange for services and or goods. They were probably not wealthy at all, but they were taking part in that monetized economy. So you could arrive and say, the wheel of my carriage broke, or my plow needs repairing. Could you fix it? And, depending on your relation with the blacksmith, maybe, probably you paid. I can't rule out that there were other means of payment, so that you might say, you do this for me now, and then at harvest time, come help on my field. You come help on my field. So that's not something that we can prove archaeologically.
Well, I think my favorite part of your answer is that it kind of, again, for me, hopefully my question and your answer are drawing a line for those in the audience who were not classics majors. But for me, it confirms that Romans did essentially what we do now, which means we're not so different from them, are we? Yeah, if I need sugar, let me just run down the hall, say, hi, you may need sugar, but like a year from now. But still, can I borrow some? And hopefully they're nice and they say yes. So it's fun to hear that people who lived so long ago were still doing the same things we are now. It's nice to hear that there's some connection between us still and the ancient Romans. And so that's really fun.
I mean, that's something that I continue to grapple with this, because I think there's, you can think about studying the ancient past and think about how similar it all looks to our world, or about how different it all looks to our world. And each position opens up different possibilities and different pitfalls. So if you focus on the similarity, for instance, I use a lot of contemporary theory about how humans and things relate to one another, theory about, from feminist studies, theory about, from development economics, how people in disadvantaged positions make do and so on. So you can use all that building on a sort of idea of a shared human component that you can locate across time. So that opens up a lot of possibilities, but of course there's massive pitfalls in imagining that the same principles held in the social world of the past as they do today. And the same goes with thinking of, say, the Romans as utterly alien to us. Of course, they're utterly aliens to us. I mean, they thought their statues were actual gods and practiced slavery without really a shirk, right? Without really having any problems with it. So yes, they're massively different to us. And that also opened up really interesting questions. It allows us to focus on those idiosyncratic aspects, but it also opens up pitfalls, because if we focus mostly on the difference, then we miss some other entry points. And we miss some of the connections that we do still, through reception, carry with us and need to grapple with, good and bad. So that was a bit of a digression, sorry, but because it's such an important point, especially for a more generalist audience, is what do we do with this sense that through reception studies we have of similarity, and do we react to it by claiming difference, or do we just continue to explore both?
It's true, and I think it's very valid to especially bring that up and discuss it, because I think living in the complex time that we do, not enough people look back and think about everything sort of in context. They don't look at I feel like we either look at, okay, I'm just looking for what's different, or I'm just trying to find a similarity, and you kind of don't get the full picture. And obviously, depending on what you're trying to use the information for, I feel like, yeah, in this time, it's really important to bring up that we should be looking at both because they both serve a very important purpose to be looked at as a whole, and not just what suits my argument or interest best.
One of my Cornell PhD students, Olivia Graves, is currently doing a study on exactly this: how were coins used in the Roman rule world and in that area of Tuscany in a sort of qualitative way, because most of these studies make big graphs and talk about supply and frequency and whatnot, but she's really thinking about behavior and how did coins, what place did they have in the social relations of the countryside at the time. So a shout out to Olivia on that theme.
Oh, that'll be really interesting. Yeah, I'll want to definitely search for that dissertation when it's done. I'll make a mental note. One other thing I did want to make sure I had time to get into was, I believe I saw that you've done a couple publications on storage and pottery. Am I remembering correctly?
Yes, two very geeky subjects. What do you want to know?
Well, I have a friend who's doing her PhD right now, and she's looking at Pompeii. She's not doing specifically storage and pottery, but a sort of similar thing. And I just remember thinking, wow, that's so cool. They can take a lot of stuff and store it in these like clay jars, essentially, not have things go bad, and transport them over long distances and have stuff arrive in pretty good condition. And so, for anyone who has not taken a class on storage or pottery or doesn't know how this works, since I have an expert in this, can you explain to my generalist audience, how does this work if I want to put stuff that's not, like, I guess the stereotypical stuff that I guess is not what we would refer to, right, as non-perishables, I guess. But yeah, so like, how did people put stuff in like big clay pots and not have spills or cracks or I'm sure that transporting stuff in a horse cart is going to go over some bumps, and you would think there might be some little cracks and things. So how did they do this and get the things again through great distances to like the cities?
Okay, well, you'll have to cut me on this subject because I can can probably fill another 5 hours with this. But I had so many thoughts in response to your question. First, there probably were loads of spills, and lots of losses to be reckoned with. And then also, yeah, this is such, I just joked by saying this is a geeky subject, and it is, but it's also such an essential subject. I mean, this is a pre-industrial world. There are no fridges, there's no cooling transport, and transport takes a long time. So, and at the same time, you have, for instance, the city of Rome, about 1 million inhabitants, unable to feed themselves. So they're completely reliant on the import of foodstuffs, perishable foodstuffs from outside, and in Rome's case, most notably the grain. So the grain trade, grain brought in from Sicily, Egypt, North Africa. So huge distances, which would have been a massive undertaking. Grain is bulky and doesn't store very well. How you do it depends on, there's various possibilities. It depends on the type of foodstuff. And it also, then with each foodstuff, you have various options that sort of, each in turn has its own implications for the social and economic possibilities it creates. So, for instance, grain really is always at threat of rotting. It doesn't get better with storage. And that seems like a very commonsensical thing to say, but it's if you think through the repercussions of that, it means like, I often compare it to a game of hot potato. You want to get rid of it as quickly as possible, but at the same time, you want a buffer because you want to have some grain in storage. So you can never really go entirely right with grain. And that grain that was shipped, for instance, from Egypt to Rome, it would have gotten moist during the journey, which was not a good thing. That would have increased rot. So there is massive operations and enormous labor involved in, once it does arrive in the warehouses of Rome's harbors, Ostia and Portus, people would have had to shovel it up, would have had to allow air to flow into, to get into contact with the grain. They would have had to deselect the rotten grain, although we know there's Sometimes samples were sent along with a bulk cargo of grain to prove the quality of the grain. So we also know there were malpractices of mixing old or rotten grain with good grain, or hiding the poor quality of your cargo or your wares. So there were all of these concerns were very much present. Whereas with something like wine, you mentioned the clay containers. So wine is a typical content. Wine ferments. If managed well, it can actually get better with fermentation. So you get, just as we have the concept of aged wines, right? You can have a wine improve in quality through storage, and initially through a storage in these large, maybe you've seen them, sort of strawberry shaped containers called dolia. If you visit Ostia or Pompeii, sometimes you see them in Rome as well, as of course. They were partly interred below floor level, so that, especially in Italy, so that you could keep the temperature rather constant, because it's very susceptible to temperature fluctuations between summer and winter. So by digging them into the ground, that was sort of one way of buffering that risk. Then we know they were sealed, often with a double lid, to prevent oxygen from entering. By the way, the real specialist in Dolia, or one of the real specialists, there's someone in France called Charlotte Carato, and then there's Caroline Chung doing fantastic work on Dolia at Princeton. So those are the people to read up on, or whose work to read, or on those aspects.
I hate to cut you off because I'm just like, yes, tell me more about how these people like transported their stuff, because I don't know. Just to kind of add to the original question, what kinds of things was deemed appropriate to pack and store and ship? Were there things that you couldn't do? I mean, just for example, right? Fish can spoil easily, and it's terribly hard to transport even now. If I leave my salmon out too long, then I don't want to eat it. So, would fish have been something you could package and put into a storage container? Or is that kind of on a list of like, no, we would not put that in there and transport it a long way?
So the Romans had this really awful concoction called garum, and that was a sort of salty fish sauce, which probably would have tasted terrible to us. But that was their way of, and it was big business actually. You had fish salting installations across the Mediterranean coast. And this sort of fish sauce thing was packed up in amphora. And transported very widely. So yes, fish, but they would have tasted rather differently to what we imagined. A nice frozen piece of fish that has traveled widely to taste like. And the other thing I wanted to stress in response to your previous question, and then I'll let you steer me again, is that these may seem like very trivial things, like, okay, how do you store fish, or how do you transport this grain, or realizing that grain rots, right? But they're so important to, because the way usually people talk about things like the supply of Rome or trade of all of these goods and foodstuffs is by drawing big arrows and big lines across the Mediterranean, across the Roman world. And that makes it seem very easy and very straightforward and very non-problematic. But it's precisely your questions of how do you avoid spills? How do you make sure these amphora don't break, right? Realizing that all these things happened and that there was sort of management and going on regarding all of these practicalities, and putting those practicalities back in can open up new questions and new insights that just sort of drawing those lines in a sterile way doesn't.
Yep, I thought it was always too simplified, looking over textbooks in class and saying, and now we have grain from Egypt. Maybe to my professor's annoyance, I would hold up the general large survey class, right, where you're supposed to get from how many different centuries in a semester class. But so maybe to a few of my professors' chagrin, I was always the one who wanted to ask, but how, but why, asking the deeper questions. So I like looking at logistics, and I know that's a really weird nerdy thing, logistics are important both in the ancient world and today. It's interesting because I feel like a lot of the more contemporary conversations I have with people in the stuff that I've done that has been quite modern and outside of classics have had to do a lot with logistics. And a lot of times I find myself saying, well, I'm sure that people have done X, Y, or Z for a very long time. Maybe we can see what other people did in the past to help us solve this logistical nightmare now.
My storage, the book that I wrote on Roman storage, was published in early 2020. And then just a few months later, after it was out and in print, the pandemic happened or broke out. And so suddenly the topic gained new relevance with, as we saw picture after picture of raided shelves of toilet paper and logistical issues of people hoarding. So there's also a part of, it's part logistics, but it's also a sort of, I call it the underbelly of society. Storage is really a topic that gets at what people hope and fear for in the future. And it was sort of a beautiful illustration, despite the very, very dark circumstances of the time, of those mechanisms at play. Fear-induced hoarding and panic, and the logistical problems in dealing with that and responding to that, and how those practicalities really resonate with something much deeper about society.
I love that really modern example. I wouldn't have even thought about that, honestly, until you just mentioned it, because I remember being one of the very both worried and annoyed people here in March 2020, being like, I literally can find no toilet paper. Help. What do I do? And who makes this stuff and how can I get more? Because all these 20 stores don't have it. Ooh, that's a very, very modern example. Wow. Flashback into 2020. Not a fun experience. I'm sure it'll be fascinating, honestly, 20 years from now to look back at 2020 and say, let's think about this. Yeah, I'm sure that'll be fascinating. Okay, so I've had the opportunity to ask you a lot about some of the more nitty-gritty, simple, tell me about this, that, and the other thing. So what I want to do, though, is pivot a little bit and ask you, out of the many, many different media portrayals of ancient Rome that do show kind of the logistical side, or the simple stuff that we don't really ask about. Do you have a favorite media adaptation that you think shows this quite well?
Oh, I'm so the wrong person to ask this to, because I have a bit of an allergy to all kinds of adaptations, good and bad. I just don't have patience for them. I don't have good knowledge at all about. Really, where I ended was Gladiator, which is now what, 20 years old? I don't know, pretty old. So, which I enjoyed as a movie. Whenever I show this or still from the movie to my students, they look at me, "You're really old." So it's not their reference point anymore, right? It's not. It's not sort of the movie they identify with or grow up with. But I don't watch, and same with reading. I don't enjoy reading or watching things about Romans in my spare time. Oh, that sounds really weird. I mean, adaptations.
No, don't worry. We get it. Yeah, no, it's fascinating because I always like to ask this only because I find that scholars in the field are quite split on it. It's really interesting how a lot of people say, yes, I study this, so I don't want to make it part of my non-professional life. Like there's a lot of other things in the world that I want to do. So I'll leave history to my job. But then there are a lot of people like me who spend every waking moment doing reception things. And so no matter how shitty and horrible and terrible certain adaptations may be, I will watch all of them just so I can judge them endlessly. But I find it quite sad that you're encountering a generation of students now who don't automatically love the Gladiator film.
Isn't there supposed to be a sequel coming out?
There is. I don't know if maybe it's coming out in 2024. I don't know when, but yes, they're working on a sequel.
Does it feature Russell Crowe? Is it?
No spoiler, because there are no spoilers about this film, but if anyone's curious about Gladiator 2, the character of Lucius,
Oh, the son.
the son of Lucilla, the emperor's sister, he apparently is going to be the main character, and he's all grown up. So it skips forward with a time jump, and he'll do something amazing, apparently. From the behind the scenes things that I've looked at throughout the years, I think there was an interview that Russell Crowe gave where when Ridley Scott originally talked about wanting to do a sequel, I think he basically said, well, I don't really want to be a different character, so can we do something with Maximus in the afterlife, like spirit sequences? And that quickly got shot down, and they were like, no, that's even for a thing on ancient Rome, they were like, that's ridiculous. We're not about to be supernatural, so no. And so then he quite quickly said, no, okay, well then don't do a straight sequel. No thanks. I'm interested to see what they do with this, but I realize I may sound like there's a lot of adaptations of ancient Rome out there. There really aren't. There's like,
What's your favorite? What should I be watching?
I want to say like the consensus one that I feel like a lot of other scholars have cited, especially the Latinists, they all really love the HBO Rome. Because even though you do get the sequences with Caesar and Octavian and Agrippa and stuff, it still shows a really good portrayal of kind of like a quote unquote normal person. So I like that. I also really like Spartacus, even though that's not a norm. That's a completely different thing, but I really enjoy it. It's bad, but in like the good way where you're like, okay, sure, this is ridiculous. Yeah.
One of my colleagues just coordinated a course series about reception studies here at Radboud University, and one of my colleagues, a Latinist, taught one of the classes on receptions of Satyricon, and he made students watch Fellini's Satyricon. I don't know if you've seen it.
No, not yet.
I mean, it's totally, we'd say totally crazy, but it's extremely experimental, and it's very, very hard to watch. Not just because there's no story, but because it's sort of meant to be uncomfortable and kind of revolting. And so that I did watch that recently now because students were assigned it. So being a good teacher, I watched it too. Yeah, and I thought at least that was interesting. It's a really interesting take on what you do with that classical past. And there are some quotes, I forget now, my recollection is poor, but my colleague Vincent Huning, who showed this, also had quotes from Fellini where he really makes that case for, the impossibility of recreation and the fact that anything is a new creation. And it's ultimately impossible to know what really happened, what life was really like, and there's no real relationship possible. So what we were saying earlier, what we were talking about, ancient worlds, similar, ancient world, different. Fellini really makes a case for ancient world, utterly different, totally alien world, and we cannot possibly relate to it. And so that's what he was trying to express with this movie. Apparently, I'm saying as a non-movie specialist. Recounting someone else's class on this topic. But so that's, if you haven't watched it, it's worth watching just for something utterly different.
Yeah, no, I'm always looking for utterly different things because I see too many of the same sort of. I can't tell you how many adaptations of Hercules I've seen. I'm honestly like very tired of Hercules, and I know Disney's talking about doing another like live action Hercules. And normally I'm excited because, I'm in the generation that grew up with all the Disney Renaissance, and I'm like, absolutely no, please don't do a live action Hercules. We don't need another one. But I digress. Disney will do Disney.
On the other trend, this is something that I applaud from the sideline because, I don't I don't have a thing with adaptations in general, but there's lots of, and also in terms of books and novels, lots of sort of retellings and reworkings, I think, of myth from a female perspective. So there's the Kirke book, and Natalie Haynes has interesting work on this. So I see and applaud the trend without being an inside fan or something, right?
See, I'm like, the fact that you can name all of these different adaptations tells me that you do know more than you think you do about all the newer, dare I call it, pop culture, quote unquote, things that have come out recently. So you do know more than you think you do. It's pretty cool. But speaking of popular media, I do want to get us into a piece of popular media, but that was popular back in 1818 and maybe is not quite as popular now, but that's debatable as well. And so the media that hopefully all my listeners will know what I'm talking about is Shelley's Ozymandias poem, which was written in 1818. And so at the end of each episode, I ask if each guest will read the poem and then give us your thoughts on what do you think this poem is about? What is it trying to tell us? Do you like the poem? Yeah, does it speak to you in any way?
Ozymandias. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculpture well those passions read, which yet survive stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round to decay of that colossal wrack, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." And now you want some deep thoughts on the poem, do you?
Yep.
I think it's a beautiful poem. I think it's, what strikes me, of course, as someone thinking very hard or trying to think very hard about material culture is the difference between all the things and then the life that's flown from them, or the life that's disappeared from them. And sort of, it seems to issue an invitation for engaging with those things as ruins, right? I mean, the thingness of the past is something that I'm super interested in. And ultimately, I guess that's the definition of archaeology, or one definition of archaeology is, or the standard definition of archaeology is, reconstructing human past from its material remains. So I think it would be a nice, somewhat romantic motto for archaeology. It also reminds me of very, very different genre, but one of my favorite poems is by Frank O'Hara, and it talks about, not about these sort of things as ruins, but about encountering things, and what do we do when we encounter things that don't speak, and yet they do kind of speak of something, but is it us projecting our language onto them, or can we find out something different? I'll leave it there, I think, but that's what strikes me about the poem.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I always love asking archaeologists because
They focus on the stuff.
you focus on the stuff, and you know what? I love focusing on the stuff, even if I am not primarily a material culture person. I still am like, it's pretty cool.
What do other people say? What have other people you've interviewed said about the poem?
Oh, so much, so much. I couldn't possibly recap everyone else's, so I'll give you mine
Yeah.
instead. Reading it from the more philological, allegorical, just almost. I also have a mind for political science, as I have a master's in poli sci, so I kind of analyze it through that lens as well. And so I think of it as a political statement by Shelley, talking about the ephemeral nature of political power, but all power in general. And this idea, right, that the poem is a memento mori, a reminder you will die, and that we, as humans, one person cannot do it all by himself. So, the statue was of the Pharaoh Ramesses II, and I would not believe for 1 second that this man ever touched a tool in his life. So he had artisans craft this statue for him. So would we remember him if these artisans did not craft his statue for him? I don't know. Maybe we would, maybe we wouldn't. And then sometimes if I get very conspiratorial about the statue, I do use my archaeology brain and say, well, I know provenience is very important to people who do material culture. How do we know that these are the head of this particular, statue? Maybe there was another one. That's just a thought experiment, but the poem implies very clearly that this is one statue.
Yeah, but so it's a memento mori, but it's saying you king, you think you're so important, but ultimately all that remains is this pedestal in the sand. But ultimately, and you said it very nicely, there's all these inequalities. Like this is the things we have, or the things we've focused on, have been largely those of the kings and so on. So they are disproportionately remembered. And then there's, as you say, those sculptors, those artisans, people feeding them, were for whom it's much more difficult to find. There's not even that statue left in the sand.
Exactly. Basically, if we're considering the poem from all of these angles that we've just talked about, the very last question that I ask each guest on the show is, if we take a moment to think about our society right now, is there a modern equivalent of an Ozymandias? Do we have a modern Ozymandias? I roughly translate that to mean, is there something that we think is great and amazing that will be around for 1,000 years, but like the statue, will it not survive that long?
Lots of things. I think you can get very, very dark and very philosophical here. I think one of these things and it's a thing, but also sort of the people with it. But the internet, of course, has been such a step change, and it's something that is very hard to imagine our world without now, and it's very difficult to imagine what it will turn into. Something else, something disappeared, or what legacy it will leave as well. So that would be, I would choose not a king or a Trump or a whatnot, but a technique, and with all of its repercussions.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I've had a few people also say the internet, especially with today's modern trend of people saying, oh, don't say this or don't write this, because if it ends up on the internet, it's going to be there forever. And I'm like, well, what is the internet but a couple big, powerful servers like stashed away in Silicon Valley here? So if those go down, bye-bye internet. So yeah,
I don't have enough technological understanding to really understand how the internet works or is powered. But yes, there's a whole material substrate to it, but also that remains very intangible even now to us, I think.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, I don't really understand or pretend to understand how or what the internet is and how it works, other than I'm like, it could be in a satellite. Maybe it's in a big server in some big underground basement. I don't know. I'm not the person who does that, but
isn't that scary though? I mean, this is digressing, but isn't it scary that we don't understand how it works? And yet we're completely reliant on it.
Yep, that's how AI takes over. So when you see all these like post-apocalyptic shows and films and books of when the AI takes over, I'm like, yeah, because we don't know how it works, and only a few people do, and they could create something that could overwhelm us, and we don't know how to stop it.
Well, this is a bright note to end on.
It's an incredibly bright note. So I'll do you one better, and I will end us on a brighter note, which is where can people find you, your research, your work? If they want to email you to, ask if they can take a class with you or come, study with you, do PhD. Yeah, where can people find you?
On the internet. Yes, there's just Google me. I'm based at a university called Radboud University in Nijmegen, which is the oldest Roman city in pretty much the only Roman city in the Netherlands, but also, a proper Roman city. So Google me and email me. I'll be happy to hear any and all inquiries or questions or messages.
Great. Well, I will link your faculty page, and I will remember right now. I'm going to link your correct one, because for whatever reason, when I Googled you, I think the first thing that came up was your old Cornell page.
And so I was based at Cornell until a year and a half ago. But that email also still works for now.
Okay.
I don't know why. I'm not quite sure why, but I still receive the email. So
Well, for anyone listening who may want to email their own logistical question and figure out, what other things were transported, or, how does money work in rural, ancient Italy, I guess you can use both emails, but we will make sure to link the correct information in the show notes. And do you have an academia page that you would like us
yeah, I'm not really good about keeping it up to date, but I do. And I've actually, I just happened earlier, the last week actually, to stumble across some half-year-old messages on that page, which I duly responded to. So better to just email me on my regular email. But I do have an academia page where what is open access is downloadable.
Great. Well, I usually put academia pages if you have them, because, usually if people want to read some of the stuff that's available, that seems to be a good place to get it. So, okay, I will also link your academia page just in case anyone wants to read what's on there. But yeah, thank you so much for joining me. I mean, I've been really enjoying myself asking all these questions that I haven't had a chance to ask or talk about for years since I graduated. So this has been a total pleasure for me.
Same. Thank you so much, Lexi, and good night.
Thank you. And, have a nice rest of your day ahead of you.
Thanks. Bye.
Trireme Transit is now departing ancient office hours. Next stop is Present Ponderings.